start our first thematic session of the day, which is related to learning from the grassroots. So, moderating this session is Ayşe Gül Altinay. Please welcome her on our esteemed panel, consisting of Lara from Anglia Ruskin University, Helen Cole from the Autonomous University of Barcelona. Well done from coming. I don't know if you really came from Barcelona. Well, a round of applause. Marina Cacace from Knowledge and Innovation, and Esin Düzel from Sabanci University, and Lina Sandström, University of Gothenburg. So before I give the floor to Ayşe Gül Altinay, I'd like to introduce her briefly. So Ayşe Gül is a professor of anthropology and gender studies with a strong focus on militarism, violence, and memory. She's also chair of the Earth-Sky Solidarity Association in Turkey. Until recent months, she was a professor of anthropology and teaching in the gender studies and cultural studies programs at Sabanci University, and is the founding director of SU Gender, which stands for Sabanci University Gender and Women's Studies Center of Excellence, where she was also very much involved in the acting project. I'd like to share with you one of Ayşe Gül's favorite statements, which I believe describes her well. She often says that the main question that shapes my work and my life is, are we going to turn our pain into more violence, hate, pain, and injustice, or into steps that multiply life, beauty, love, peace, and justice? So I must say that this call for resilience and beauty has been reflected in the acting project, which has precisely focused its research on better stories of behavioural change among marginalised groups and focusing on solution. So give the floor to you, and let's dive into the project's research. Thank you very much.
Thank you. What a beautiful, generous introduction, Colette, and with the poetic beginning by Auntie and the great opening speech. It's really, I think we're into a really exciting start. And I'm really, really excited and happy to be here, and also very privileged to be chairing this session for acting, which I think is a valuable and rare project that has walked its talk in terms of integrating a gender plus intersectional lens in its complex analysis of who is made more vulnerable in relation to not only the ecological and climate crisis we live in, but also the Green Deal policies that respond to it. So acting has also walked its walk in terms of learning from the grassroots, which is the main focus of this particular panel. And this is not only about producing knowledge on the grassroots, but is about being curious and open to learning from the knowledge and the wisdom that's already there in the grassroots and that is constantly being remade and recreated. So in other sessions, we will hear more examples of research as a better story of co-creation of knowledge, co-creation of policy responses, and co-creation of collective responses to the great challenges of our time. And in this session, we will hear acting research results and reflections, as well as valuable presentations by researchers from outside of acting, Lara and Helen Cole. It's great to have you in this panel. And each panelist will be sharing their insights on learning from the grassroots based on their own research. I would just like to go over the grand questions that are shaping this panel that will be part of both the presentations and the discussions afterwards. So the first question we've asked ourselves is, what can we learn from the grassroots? In other words, from the communities made vulnerable by the ecological crisis and or by Green Deal policies, as well as from the organized voices from activists, unions, and NGOs. The second question is, what is the significance of engaging the grassroots, both in terms of communities and their engaged voices, for a fair and inclusive Green Deal and for better knowledge production? And what do we miss when we miss this engagement? The third question has to do with the research methodologies. What research methodologies or approaches are needed to ensure that our knowledge production speaks to the multidimensional and gender plus intersectional vulnerabilities we observe in the field and makes the multiple actors in the grassroots communities visible. And finally, what strategies for knowledge dissemination help these goals? What are some of the creative strategies of knowledge dissemination that empower grassroots communities at the same time as helping us to co-create a just transition? And this panel is exactly about that. So we will first hear short presentations from this great panel, and I will introduce each person before they speak, and then we will engage in a discussion based on these questions. So let us begin with Marina Cacace, who will be presenting the overall acting results. I've had the great pleasure of working with Marina in multiple projects in recent years. She is a very inspiring senior researcher and gender expert at Knowledge and Innovation based in Italy. Her research has focused on science-society relations from a gender perspective, while her interests also include poverty and social exclusion, and from a methodological perspective, the application of complexity frameworks to evaluation. Over the last decade, Marina has been involved in the design and evaluation of a number of gender equality plans in several EC-funded projects on institutional change in research organizations. Welcome, Marina.
Thank you very much, Ayşe Gül, for the presentation of the panel, and also good morning, everybody, also from my side, and thank everybody for being here. So let's see if this works. So my task here is to briefly present the overall results of the research component of the ACTING project. I relate here to the presentation from Sofia this morning, who already explained how complex the setup of the ACTING project was. I will focus actually on what we set out to investigate within the project. So the general idea also from the call, from the commission, was about how to support behavioral change, so individual and collective behavioral change towards more sustainability. Of course, framing critically this research objective about not just so much pushing change towards individuals, but really understanding the conditions under which change is possible. And also policies to support green transition are not harming the most vulnerable people exposed to vulnerability conditions. Also, we started with acknowledging behavioral change as a complex object, which is not just the result of a decision, an individual, psychological or factor, but as the result of a multitude of factors at different levels which interact in sometimes also surprising ways and with different outcomes in different circumstances. So our theoretical approaches, as I think it's clear by now, focus on vulnerable groups not just as victims or people to be convinced, but as key actors in managing environmental transition in an intersectional approach, and also, as is I think also one of the main, most important focus on this panel, is the idea of combining different knowledges, because based on our approach, of course, we need interdisciplinary scientific approaches, but we also need to really start from also the knowledge that's there in the grassroots, in the people made vulnerable by different circumstances and organizing themselves and also using local and traditional knowledge. Having said that, this is an overall picture of all the areas of all our research lines. The colors, different colors refer to the areas of the Green Deal that the different research lines refer to. So, but they all, in general, even though they deal with different areas, sectors, research questions, they all have to do with inclusivity, working with and for social communities and leveraging on their experiences and knowledge. So in disaster management and preparedness, through the use of local and traditional knowledge, this was research line 1. In nature stewardship action from vulnerable groups, vulnerable communities, in research line 2. And then when it comes to clean energy, on the one hand, how to make energy communities, which in general are an expensive thing. So how to make this not just for middle-class people who can buy the implant, but really an inclusive way for everybody to address energy poverty and support the transition. And then micro-enterprises, that would be research line 4, micro-businesses, sometimes also informal, are generally considered incapable for lack of resources to contribute to the transition. And we have seen how this can, not always, but can not be the case. So they can actually, and they do in some cases, a lot for this. And then when we come to food, we have local initiatives, grassroots local initiatives, supporting access of people to in disadvantaged neighborhood and areas to healthy and sustainable food on the one hand, or really promoting food values related to sustainability, and also investigating how this relates then to changing behavior. Sustainable mobility, you had some examples now of policies about sustainable mobility by our keynote speaker, Dun Sawyer. So in one case, inclusive cycling. So people who culturally or for different structural reasons are not there and are not able to benefit of the option of cycling, and carefree policies limiting cars, etc., and how this is received on the end of people who are more disadvantaged. Of course, I will not go into this. This was just to scare everybody about how much could I talk. But actually, we will just refer to the fantastic synthesis and report from our colleagues, Zora Student-Standring. Caroline should be here actually in my place, and so we say hello and thank to her. So some cross-cutting aspects, because of course, as I said, there was a very common matrix from which we developed our research. And so I would start with local and community-based approach, and we could see how really, yes, we said change is not just a technical thing. It is not just that. It is not just, although very important, a financial thing, economic thing, access to financial resources. Change, what we really highlighted is how change is really embedded in social relationships, so the social dimension of change. We wanted to focus on that aspect, cultural practices and everyday lived experiences of people. And that's why the focus on community-led approaches, which can more holistically address the lived experience and the real needs of people in an area or in a situation, and make possible co-creation processes that, of course, make policies more acceptable when they are possible. And I want to make, I think, if this is working, yes. And I think one of the nicest examples we have of change is social, is this community of practice, this energy community, within Research Line 3, where there was a very cohesive community already sharing collective services like for the children, for the elderly, that started to reduce energy consumption in a significant way, even before being able to secure the funds for the photovoltaic implant. This is because they started meeting and doing with the expert, inviting people, doing collective readings of energy bills, etc. So this is, I think, a nice example. But of course, not all, we also applied a qualitative comparative approach to, for instance, the different energy communities in this case that we have been analyzing. And of course, it doesn't always work so well. So the recipe, so to speak, where when they work better, energy communities had started from a cohesive community. And when there's no cohesive community, this is something really that initiatives are needed, where initiatives are needed to work, where effective participation mechanisms are in place, and when capacity building opportunities, of course it's obvious, but when you really want to be inclusive, then tailored forms of capacity building are needed. Then if we go to the second, social support networks and peer influence. This is connected to what I just said, but is maybe really the anthropological and social basis of that. So here we don't have already established community organizations or initiatives, but we have people in their social family networks, which consistently emerge as really enablers, important enablers of behavioral change. An example that comes to my mind is about cycling. So how important, and I'm looking at Eden here, how really it is important to be included in a group that's doing that, that's valuing cycling, and how this is sometimes the major motivator, besides, of course, having access to a bike. So they provide access to resources, but knowledge, motivation, social appreciation. And now this is important to shift the focus from targeting, for instance, in communication efforts for the environment or dissemination, etc., from individuals intended as isolated units to supporting these collective, sometimes even embryonic, collective dynamics of change. An example that comes to my mind is about what was studied under research line 5 and 6. These were about food and sustainable and healthy food, for instance, in very disadvantaged communities, and how the solution of involving participants in food production was particularly maybe the most successful one, so community gardens, not something particularly new. But community gardens promoted really the exchange of cultivation techniques, traditional knowledge, including, for instance, plants from the migrants' country of origin, recipes, and this provided validation of one's knowledge and social appreciation in the community, and was the most important factor that we found in our qualitative analysis. No, okay. Was associated the most with behavioral change in terms of one's diet. I already apologized to my colleagues for this very brutal synthesis of the. Then when we come to intersectionality, vulnerability, and the power dimension specifically, as cross-cutting results, of course, it was not difficult to document the unequal impact of sustainability. Now, I'm not talking of the climate change, but really also the policies to address climate change. And it's clear that lack of resources in more marginalized groups can lead to the inability to participate in the transition. And also, what is even more painful for people, and we talk with people about this, is the, in some cases, being some way forced to oppose some policies, even though there might be an environmental awareness and willingness to do something. So it's like the environmental agency of some people are kicked out of the picture, in a sense, because they really have no alternatives. So this is also comes to another point which came out quite clearly in some research lines. So to distinguish also the positionalities of people very carefully, because on the one hand, and they are the most vocal, we have the relatively vulnerable, so people exposed to some area of vulnerability, but not socially excluded or severely damaged by their condition. And on the other hand, we have the more marginalized groups that sometimes really have difficulties in being included, even in, for instance, protesting. So an example is in research line 8, the one on mobility policies, where we had, in one case, some social movements of political nature who had in their agenda both social and environmental struggles, and they found themselves strongly opposing, even sabotaging actively the car-free, the limitation to the mobility of cars, because they felt there was a situation of in a disadvantaged neighborhood with some geographical isolation. They felt it placed the burden of change on the less affluent groups, and this was really producing a big strain in the group because of this contradiction. And here, so we saw in this kind of groups also a resource. So resistance to sustainability policies in some cases can support progressive policy change. And this happens in our cases when those who protest are also committed to or anyway open to environmental. It's clear that in cases like the Gilets jaunes, of course, these are more difficult to engage, but there are a lot of other situations out there. And of course, when these groups are able to keep into the perspective of disadvantage, of more disadvantaged groups in different ways. And I go to my last slide. It's the last. I will be quicker here because we had already a lot on this. And actually, while listening to Sawyer, I thought we saw a little bit positive results in the other three areas, a bit more pessimistic here. But while listening to you, I thought, well, I didn't have time to change the slide. Anyway, so what we found is that while people were saying how much social level, community level factors were generally reported as enablers of change, as we were discussing before, when it came to policies, also infrastructure, thinking of cycling, for instance, mobility, etc., were really reported to as really hindrances. And of course, this is not difficult to understand because very often systemic inequalities, lived experiences, so the real consequences on people are overlooked. The importance of grassroots experience is not really recognized, and participatory processes are poorly designed and communicated. And in some cases, we have the impression that, talking with policymakers, we had the impression that this was because of maybe lack sometimes of know-how, capability. In some other cases, it could even be sort of choice to be a bit superficial in that because policies, okay, the administrative action is already complicated, you don't want to stop it. So yes, we had a lot of examples of not recognizing grassroots expertise, for instance, when it comes to disaster management, even though we could also document how community practices, while once acknowledged and valued, could really improve preparedness and disaster management. So that would be it, because as a final thing I wanted to say, how can we create negotiation space with authorities in the face of all those obstacles, let's say. So what we witnessed were, on the one hand, collective action where nothing was there. On the other hand, local knowledge, because local knowledge is something that can be recognized as helpful by all and can be helpful to reconcile the socio-economic needs on the one hand with nature protection on the other hand, because local knowledge is local, and so people know their surroundings, not just physically, not just geographically, but also from the point of view of the social and economic needs and lived experience of people. And that would be it. Thank you.
Is this open? Can I use this? Yeah, okay. Perfect. Thank you so much, Marina, for that lively introduction of only some of the findings of acting research. So we will hear more about the specifics, learnings from different research lines later in the panel from Lina and Esin. But now we move on to Lara Houston, who is a research fellow at the Global Sustainability Institute, a research group at Anglia Ruskin University in the UK. She investigates sustainability through grassroots, citizen-led practices, studying how citizens create alternative ways of knowledge production. She specializes in creative, inventive, and participatory methods that we'll be hearing more about. And today she'll focus on inclusive arts-based approaches for learning from the grassroots.
Oh, thank you so much, everyone. Let's just, oh, maybe I'm not. Carry on. Oh no, sorry. These are not the art space slides that I was expecting. Although they're wonderful. Hey, here we go. Thanks, everyone. Okay, so thank you so much for the invitation to speak on this panel and to share some reflections on what I've learned from the grassroots. And that's in particular, as Ayşe Gül has said, from working on arts and sustainability projects that aim really to include communities made marginalised or rendered vulnerable. And today I'm going to give some really short remarks on two projects, arts and ecology projects from the Horizon 2020 project Creatures, that's creative practices for transformational futures. And much like acting structure, the Creatures project funded artists to do pilot actions, and I worked with them as participant and co-researcher. So today's talk is really kind of staying at the level of practice and speaking to Ayşe Gül's questions about kind of research and co-creation methods. So the first action is called Yarmouth Springs Eternal, and that took place in the coastal town of Great Yarmouth in the UK. And this has been kind of a seaside resort since the Victorian times. It has an amazingly long and rich history of migration, but unfortunately at the minute it's struggling with multiple forms of deprivation. So the project was developed by community artist Genevieve Rudd. It involved a series of 8 walks, some led by artists, by ecologists and local people, and each walk really aimed to draw attention to overlooked aspects of urban nature. So although the project was really open to everyone, it did make a very special effort to create a welcoming space for people with lived experiences of homelessness, people with mental health challenges, and people with lived experiences of migration, whether that was a chosen migration or whether they were having the experience of refugee or asylum status. And 3 key learnings really stood out from the project. And I think probably, as everyone in the room knows, the importance of creating long-term trusted relationships with communities. And artist Genevieve Rudda really worked hard to get to know people with these kind of homeless and migrant experiences through local charities, Gyros and the Herring House Trust. But I think what was really interesting about this art space project was seeing the effectiveness of using mindfulness techniques throughout. So each walk leader really asked everyone to be present in our bodies, present in place. One of the walks led by an ecologist called Tiffany Wallace focused on appreciating weeds. So we kind of gathered parts of the weed, kind of looking for nature in unexpected places, and drew them, kind of really trying to boost this ecological awareness and values to understand the kind of overlooked urban ecosystem in Great Yarmouth. And in a walk led by artist Jacques Nimke, which you can see here, we were asked to kind of tune into our senses of sight, touch, and smell, and we scavenged some of these natural treasures and brought them back to the studio and just used paint to mix matching and complementary colors. So really trying to tap into these other ways of knowing nature, other ways of knowing the world, and using that as a space to share our experiences. And the final insight from this project is really, and I think Marina's so strong on this point, treating participants as experts in their own practices and in their own places. So members of the group were supported actually to lead the final 4 walks, and you can see them preparing for that here. So that allowed them to lead people around the town as they inhabited it and to kind of focus their attention on how they understood the place. And you can imagine if you've been homeless in a place, you bring a really different lens to understanding nature in that capacity. For some participants, kind of having that opportunity to lead was quite a meaningful experience. So one participant said, 6 years ago, when I was in the depths of depression and addiction, I would never have thought I would be leading a group. It's really boosted my confidence and inspired me. So very quickly to take you through the second project called View from the Window. That was led by artist Martina Miller. An artist in the collective Domi had begun to restore this old building in the city of Poznan in Poland. And it had formerly been the home of a photoplasticon, which I understand is like a zoetrope for moving images. So it had this amazing history, again, of being this space of enjoyment, of cultural practice and identity. And artists got quite fed up of the garden outside the gallery being used as a car park, pretty skillfully, as you can see here. And they initiated a project to develop it into a shared garden for local neighbours. And they really asked themselves, okay, who are these neighbours that we can collaborate with to create the garden? And how do we go about starting that collaboration? And the project really responds to the architecture of the street itself. So on 3 sides, it's kind of dwarfed by these taller apartment buildings. So the kind of idea of view from the window is to invite those that have a direct view of the gallery from their home. So our artist Martina Miller, she began to set up a series of picnics outside the gallery on the weekend. She invited everyone who had this view onto the building to come down, be part of the picnic, but also to have a special photo portrait taken. So through the kind of convivial setting of bringing and sharing food, this kind of the creation of this public or group began, and it really involved an interesting group of people who were minoritized in different ways. That included queer artists who were taking refuge in the gallery, but also lots of incomers fleeing war from Ukraine, so having that experience of being a war refugee. So incrementally, week by week, they just started planting stuff and gardening together. whilst at the same time kind of starting to create these bigger designs for the space outside. And the artist later held an exhibition displaying all the portraits, as you can see here, and some proposed designs for the garden as they had iteratively developed them. And just to wrap up with 2 final key learnings, I really learned about the importance of a generous invitation. So what was so compelling about this project, View from the Window, was the way it brought outsiders to become insiders. So being invited to have their photograph taken and then having that photograph placed inside the gallery in the exhibition kind of brought the neighbours, first of all, symbolically into the space, into the gallery, but of course also physically, because loads of people just went to see themselves, see their neighbours, and it really sort of, you know, set up this inversion where, you know, people outside became inside the gallery and vice versa. So my final point is really including communities that have been marginalised. It really does mean carefully designing process where people can encounter each other convivially, you know, kind of feeling and seeing each other's differences, but in an open and accepting space. And I hope this really brief remarks have hinted at the potential for arts-based approaches to create these mindful, these convivial spaces where people can see their identities reflected and see their contributions valued. So thanks everyone very much.
Thank you so much, Lara, for this very inspiring presentation. Auntie had talked about the infinite possibilities in the smallest of things, and it's exactly what we see here, the infinite creativity that's there, and also the interlinkages between individual, collective, and planetary healing are very much there in these examples. Thank you. So now we move on to Helen Cole, who bravely, courageously made it from Barcelona to Brussels today to join us. We're really grateful to have you here. Helen Cole is senior researcher at the Institute of Environmental Science and Technology of the Autonomous University of Barcelona. She's a core member of the Barcelona Lab for Urban Environmental Justice and Sustainability and is currently co-scientific coordinator of the Horizon Europe project Green Me, a sister project, which aims to scale up the use of green care toward achieving adult mental health and well-being equity in Europe. She's done very inspiring work on especially urban poverty and urban inclusion, so we're very privileged to have you here on this panel. Thank you. Thank you.
I should say that I don't feel very brave. I feel like I was safely here watching my friends at home suffer through a blackout. In reality, the Barcelona airport was miraculously up and running and completely normal yesterday. But all that aside, I first wanted to ask, are there any other public health researchers here? No? Okay, well, hopefully I can explain then my thoughts in a way that will still be relevant to you. And I framed my thoughts today around the field of public health because it's the field that my training is from, and therefore the one that I feel most comfortable with, but also more importantly, it being the field that I'm most familiar with, despite doing a lot of interdisciplinary work, it's also the field that I feel the most comfortable critiquing. And so first I wanted to describe some of the research that I've done in the past and how we've sort of highlighted the specific and somewhat different needs and worries of vulnerable or marginalized communities. So first of all, public health is a field that regularly sort of visibilizes vulnerable communities, but normally in a way that's not very in-depth. So normally what we do, we just highlight these, the differences between groups, so the differences in health outcomes between marginalized groups and others. And so you can think of that For example, if you see a statistic that shows that people who live in a certain neighborhood have a life expectancy that's much lower than others who live in a more wealthy neighborhood. That's a very standard public health statistic. So in our work over the past several years, we were looking at something called green gentrification. Have you heard of green gentrification? I see more nods with that than I did with public health. Very good. And so placing that in the way we understand how green space benefits health in the field of public health, we're used to thinking of green space as innately good, as something that creates better health for people that live near it because it encourages physical activity and it cleans the air and it provides a calm and peaceful environment, a place to reflect, opportunities for socialization and others. But what we set out to answer was if green space or the creation of new green space or the improvement of existing green space is also involved in this process of gentrification, then at the end of the day, who does stand to benefit from green space? Is it still the case that, as we tend to think in the way we frame questions in public health, that green space is just good and everyone will benefit from it because we've put it in a place where those who need it most need it? But what we found out is that indeed, at times when green space is involved in these processes of green gentrification, it's not everyone that benefits from them. And in fact, people who come from marginalized groups may not benefit from it for various reasons. So they may not benefit from it because they're being driven out of the neighborhood due to these processes of gentrification, or maybe it's just that they don't feel comfortable in these new spaces that were designed to meet their needs or are now populated by people who are not part of their communities. There's also this process of the disruption of social networks in these situations. And so the ways that we went around doing that were a few. One was really using more traditional public health methods, so from the field of epidemiology especially, which we all know a little bit more about because of the pandemic. And so just using quantitative data that already existed to tease out the differences in effect based on social class and race and level of education. So that was one way. And then we also used qualitative methods. So in the framework of another large project, we interviewed people who lived in neighborhoods who were affected by green gentrification. So these tend to be neighborhoods with a history of environmental degradation. And through those interviews, we found out a lot more about the way they experienced those changes in their neighborhood. So all this to say that this process of studying this topic made me realize that the field of public health has a lot of room to grow, and maybe your fields do too. In that in public health thank you. In public health, we have all of this real-world data, but the way we tend to deal with it is by controlling out all of the interesting, messy differences. And that's because we rely a lot on statistics to do the work that we do. But I think that there's a lot of room to grow in terms of not needing to do that or approach it in that way. So I also wanted to mention that despite that this is a limitation in the way that we do our work in our field, there's also been a lot of progress made. And we've seen over the past 5 to 10 years, for example, a lot more emphasis on what we call structural determinants of health. So those are things like laws or policies that ultimately lead to hierarchical power structures that ultimately lead to the reason we see differences in health outcomes between marginalized groups and others. And specifically, we've seen the publication of some key articles in even very well-trusted medical journals like JAMA and the New England Journal of Medicine. So that, I think, shows great progress for where the field is going. But at the same time, it's really important to mention, and I hope that we can all maybe think about this a bit more, that that progress isn't maybe going to stay, given that a lot of the work within the field of public health and perhaps others in building new methodologies for measuring things like structural racism, in promoting, for example, the collection of data around gender and race and ethnicity. A lot of that was funded by the National Institutes of Health and other agencies within the US government, and all of that is being destroyed at the moment. So that means that not just that projects that are focusing on these issues are being defunded, but that they're effectively making it, disallowing the collection of those data that we spent a long time working on improving. And that really has a huge emphasis in not just the data that we have, but our ability to do this work. And I think it's also important for us to think about that in the context of Europe and the place that Europe has in promoting this type of research, because now is perhaps a time when it's time for Europe to take the driver's seat in terms of moving this forward. And I have no idea how long I spoke, but that's okay, perfect. So that's what I prepared today. I know it's kind of not as participatory as some of the other researchers spoke about, but I also wanted to highlight that you can still think in this way of sort of privileging or highlighting the needs of vulnerable groups, even using more traditional and more structured and less participatory methods. Thank you.
Beautiful. Thank you, Helen. And also thank you for bringing in the perspective of public health and well-being and the significance of space and place, especially in the urban context, into this conversation. So we'll have more of a chance to continue this discussion after hearing the last two presentations. So we go back to acting. We have two great researchers who have contributed to acting in the past 3.5 years. And we'll first hear from Lina Sandström, who's a senior research lecturer in sociology at Örebro University and senior researcher at the Department of Sociology and Work Science at the University of Gothenburg. And Lina will be talking about bottom-up and top-down perspectives on inclusive and sustainable mobility.
Okay, so Marina has prepared me a little bit. We touched upon some of the things I will speak about. So I joined acting as a researcher in the second cycle, and I was involved in 2 research lines that explored just transitions in mobility from 2 distinct perspectives. So research line 7 focused on bottom-up cycling initiatives aimed at empowering vulnerable groups, examining their impact on behavioral change. Whereas research line 8, by contrast, assessed the impact of top-down transport policies on vulnerable groups and how vulnerabilities shape individual and collective responses to these policies. Especially car-free policies, I should add. So around 160 qualitative interviews were conducted in 7 different countries. And the majority of these interviews were with members of groups marginalized on different grounds. So it could be gender, age, ethnicity, disability, socioeconomic status, or other grounds, or intersection of these. As in the overall acting project, the research lines on mobility address the unequal effects of climate change, the potentially unequal effects of policy aimed to combat climate change, and what can enable or hinder behavioral change on the individual level. And this last part can be ethically challenging when conducting research with marginalized communities. And I can certainly see the irony in the fact that I have flown here to speak about the behavioral change of people who in most cases have a smaller ecological footprint than my own. So many of the people interviewed lived in some degree of transport poverty, and this meant that they quite often already traveled sustainably, not by choice necessarily, but out of necessity. And crucially, some had limited access to any form of transportation. So on that note, it's important to clarify that the behavioral change studied in research line 7 was not necessarily about giving something up. Rather, it was about increasing mobility in a sustainable way by gaining a new skill or gaining the confidence to make use of an existing one. So a range of initiatives that promote cycling in different ways were studied, and we looked at whether these initiatives managed to increase participants' competence to cycle safely, whether they increased access to a bicycle that suited their needs, and whether they led to an embrace of cycling as a form of transportation, and perhaps even, making cycling part of your identity. And what we found was that these initiatives often succeeded in lowering barriers to cycling, and in addition, cycling emerged as a tool for empowerment and independence. It had a positive effect on physical and mental health. It helped break social isolation, and it led to community building. But, there's always a but, also clear from the participants' stories is that many challenges remained, especially in countries where biking infrastructure was poor. And while cyclists are always vulnerable in cities that are primarily designed for cars, some cyclists experience greater challenges, namely those who are both vulnerable and relying on additional support. For example, children, seniors, and people with disabilities. We also found that cultural changes also persist, and in some cases the embrace of cycling was both partial and temporary. And this was perhaps most clearly seen in the Portuguese case, where the young people interviewed showed a great appreciation for the cycling initiative, but they also highly valued cars as status symbols, and they all wished to drive themselves in the near future. Car culture was even more present in research line 8. They focused on different policies that aim to reduce car use in disadvantaged urban areas. All these policies were met with resistance from residents, but especially those that targeted car use directly. This was not simply out of self-interest, however, and many people that did not drive themselves objected to these policies. Mainly because they were seen as deeply unfair, since more affluent people were able to pay their way out of some of these car-free policies by buying a low-emission vehicle or paying high parking fees, for example. The absence of viable alternatives to car use, such as public transport and bike lanes, added to the resistance. While the unequal effects of these policies fueled the resistance of the residents, the impact on marginalized groups was not considered in the design of these policies, and in most cases there was little evidence of any sort of participatory process. And in the Swedish case, where I was more directly related or involved, public consultation was actively avoided. So this case focused on a new bus system in a mid-sized city, and one policymaker interviewed described how they had to trust their own expertise on the matter, as the public are not able to envision future needs. So he meant that asking the public what they need or want now will stop the transition that's needed for the future. The initial aim of this new bus system was to reduce traffic congestion by making public transport a faster, more attractive option. Car use would be discouraged by the introduction of bus lanes along the main thoroughfare of the city, and the two endpoints of this thoroughfare were disadvantaged areas. And one of these areas was the focus of my case study. So while the project was faced with considerable protests in other parts of the city, voices from these disadvantaged communities were rarely heard, and the silence was interpreted as contentment. However, once it had become clear to the authorities that these protests were not going away, they tried to promote the benefits of this project in different ways. And one such way was to reframe it as an integration project. So the project, it was claimed, would benefit integration by tying disadvantaged areas to the city center. But the authorities were clearly trying to target new users willing to switch from car to bus rather than the already existing bus users in these disadvantaged areas. And the residents interviewed objected strongly to being portrayed as the beneficiaries of a policy that they had not asked for. And while not everybody in this area was against the policies, they all agreed that they would prefer cheaper buses to faster buses. And older people living in the area also expressed concern that in order to make the travel time from point A to B quicker, they removed several bus stops on the way, so the walk to the nearest stop would be longer. So this reframing of the project also backfired in the sense that it led to deeper divisions rather than integration. So this is an ongoing dispute, and there's still protest groups online, and in these protest groups you can often read quite racist narratives that this project is benefiting people that they see as least deserving, portrayed as welfare-dependent immigrants living in disadvantaged areas. So it's a question of taxpayer money being spent on people not paying taxes. That's how they portray it, yeah. So to summarize, not including marginalized voices in policy consultation comes with a number of risks. So first, it means that unequal effects will all too often remain unacknowledged. Second of all, the lack of consultation reinforces the sense of powerlessness and distrust in policymakers, often expressed by the residents, sometimes increasing resistance to the policies. Third of all, the lack of participatory processes creates a fertile ground for populist politics that does not necessarily value environmental nor social sustainability. So as seen in the Swedish case, this kind of surface engagement with inequality only served to kind of alienate both marginalized groups and others, potentially leading to deeper divisions. So bringing this back to this initial distinction between bottom-up, top-down initiatives, the contrast between bottom-up initiatives, kind of positive message of empowerment, and the disempowering effect of top-down policy could lead one to conclude that one is preferable over the other. But the reality is, of course, much more complex. So the infrastructural problems identified by these bottom-up initiatives requires policymaking to be solved. Yet the very bike lanes that are needed can also cause considerable protests, especially if the policy process does not adequately consider the impact of the policy. So from a policy learning perspective, the potential lies in developing strategies to encourage genuine engagement and address community-specific needs without simply yielding to the most vocal and influential groups. That's it. Sorry.
Thank you, Lina. Really, I think both you and Helen have started answering the question, what do we miss when we miss participation or when we miss the perspective, the needs of the grassroots communities themselves. So we will now listen to our last presentation by Esin Düzel. Esin is an anthropologist with a PhD from the University of California, San Diego. She has worked on utopian movements, feminist war and peace studies, political ecology, and sustainability transitions. Her publications include academic articles and an ongoing book project that I look forward to reading on the transformation of the values, body politics, and subjectivities in the Kurdish utopian movement. In the ACCTING project, Esin Düzel has been conducting research, mainly in research lines 1 and 2, but contributing to also 5 and 6. And she's the acting PI at the Sabanci University team. Based in Helsinki and partially in Izmir, she continues her work across academia, civil society, and politics on just green transition, militarism, and feminist forest politics.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here. Thanks for putting this panel together, and also for colleagues at Yellow Window and ESF for taking care of the logistics of our conference. And I would like to thank also to my research colleagues in research line 1 and 2, with whom we have developed all these research methodologies, and also my wonderful research partner here, Ayşe Gül, with whom we conducted the research that will inform my presentation today. Today I'll be talking about the 2 examples that we found very inspiring in our Turkey component of the research. So just a little bit of the context. In the last 4 to 5 years and even more, Turkey has been experiencing 2 serious developments that threatens its forests very deeply. The first one is that we have been experiencing more fires, more forest fires that are covering wider areas. The scholars say that the number of the fires have not necessarily increased, but they are more impactful. They cover more areas. And most recently, in 2001, we have experienced a big fire that counts as a mega fire, affecting more than 150,000 hectares of land, the largest in the last 70 years or so. And this has become a new normal in a way. And the second very serious development that threatens the forests is the constant degradation and degradation of the forests and deforestation. This is due to extractivist developmentalist policies. Forests are divided, fragmented, cleared for several reasons, for infrastructure projects, wind projects, energy transmission lines, mining sites. Several mining permissions are given in forest areas, for tourism, for hotels, for golf courses. Several reasons have turned the forest into really fragmented, divided areas. And the allotments of forests to such uses might even last from 50 to 100 years, making it really, really hard to reverse their impact. And for some, even they leave more permanent impacts than what the forest did, because when forest places have the capacity to regenerate, but when such permanent damage is done, it's really hard to reverse such cases. And in the pictures, you see a really inspiring protest against the expansion of a coal mine in Akbelen in Muğla area, that we had the amazing opportunity to meet with these women. And this is also from the coal side. Unfortunately, the forest is lost, but their struggle has made it to national and even international news and have garnered a lot of support for the environmental cases. What was also interesting and eye-opening and very exciting across these cases that we research amidst these very dire circumstances is that we realize how little we know of women's roles in defending the forests. When these issues come up, usually the publics, and this is probably not unique to Turkey, but the publics either look for, policy change or, some institutional change or some, political change, some macro level changes, or people call for, more technologies, advanced technologies to intervene in the fires or, the reversal of the biodiversity crisis, so on and so forth, and which both of them are, of course, true causes, very valid causes, but depending or using our feminist framework in acting, we were wondering, we started to ask, okay, but who are the most vulnerable groups impacted by these developments? Where are they in forest defense? Where are they in forest intervention, fire intervention, forest protection, and what can we learn from them? So in our research, together with Ayşe Gül, we visited these 3 villages, Ahmetler village in Antalya in southern Turkey, and Bozyar village in Muğla, and Birgi village in Izmir. You see one of the village head women here, Sevil Duman, posing with her husband. We were seeing that, women forest villagers is a group, is a social group that is less known, less recognized in the country and beyond again. And they are, according to the recent data, the population living in the forest account to 7 million, constituting approximately 8% of the population of Turkey. And they make their living, forest villagers make their living from forestry or involved in economic activities directly related to these areas. So the forests are really their life spaces. They live in the forest, they live with the forest. They do goat or sheep herding, animal husbandry, or they forage for herbs and mushrooms, which really constitute the vast basis for their very deep knowledge of the forest. And in this village, in the Ahmetler village that we visited, that you see some of the pictures here, in this mega fire that I mentioned in 2021, villager women were in the front lines of the fire intervention. And this was one of the really interesting cases, not us as these researchers in the field, but the public officers also acknowledged. They picked up their rakes, they picked up their shovels, and whatever tools they used in their everyday farming activities, and they showed up at the front lines of fire intervention. They cleared the paths so that the fire trucks or water tankers could move. They showed alternative paths for these vehicles because they know these paths through grazing or foraging. And when there was a need to carry a very heavy hose, up to a hill, they gathered, they organized among themselves quickly, and they helped the fire workers. They also knew the community resources well. They knew who is the most vulnerable, who is not able to evacuate in case of a more serious situation, or whose children could help in what way, so on and so forth. So they had already a lot of knowledge about getting organized because they had previously stopped the building of a water dam. So they had some, activist knowledge. They had some knowledge of getting organized. So when they met with the very dire circumstance of this very big forest fire, they transferred that knowledge and that wisdom to this valley. And they actually stopped and you can see the line where they really stopped the spreading of the fire from towards the other valleys, to their own valley and towards the other valleys, preventing it becoming a even bigger fire. The second example I would like to give to you very quickly is the Sarıkeçililer nomadic group, who is called Yellow Goats, and one of the fully nomadic groups in Turkey. They are goat herders, and they live in vast geography in the Mediterranean coastal areas, Taurus Mountains, and central Anatolia. They, of course, have deep knowledge of the forest and its multiple beings. From children onwards, they read and predict weather. They know the goats by their name, and they actually find goats as the laboratory of their lives. When they see if the goat is eating something, it's safe to eat. Drinking a water, it's clean enough to eat. And their life spaces are deeply impacted by the developments I mentioned, and they have come around as an organization, Life and Solidarity Association, and they have an amazing, amazing woman leader, Pervin Savran, and she's the inspiring community leader who is leading and really empowering every single community member. With Pervin Savran's leadership, they have managed to change the law in 2012, winning their rights to graze the forest areas. And when they
organize their activities, they reflect their lifestyle. For instance, if they want to make a demand, they organize a march like they do in their seasonal migration. So they march 530 kilometers during 43 days from Mersin, a city in South Turkey, to Ankara to really demand this change in law. And they learn a lot from nature, they live with nature, so when they see the impacts of the climate change, they say that, you know, it's the only way that we can adapt learning about the nature with nature. And very quickly about fire intervention, their goats have been very leading forces in spreading the fire, in preventing the spread of the fire in this area, because the goats, you know, urinate, they eat the dry grass, so they literally stop the spreading of fire, and we see this phenomenon in other places as well. So just to wrap up here, we found that women in vulnerable groups like forest villagers have a lot of wisdom, and they're actually doing the work in their everyday lives in dealing with several threatening circumstances to their forests, to their life spaces. And we also found that not only in Turkey, but in other cases we research across Europe, when women are placed in also authority level, when they lead, they establish these connections amongst themselves and create real change. And most recently, we found that the Izmir municipality's fire department has a very unique branch called Forest Villages and Rural Areas Fire Intervention, which focuses on the fire in rural areas. And they have recently a unit director who's a woman who celebrated, there she is, Şerife Güzel, who celebrated March 8th with other women village heads. And that was a very empowering celebration, empowering event for them. And I would like to also announce that with our colleagues at CERC in Greece, we are organizing an international webinar with the women in fire intervention and also nomadic communities, with those in Greece. And we are organizing this Turkish and Greek international webinar, which will be posted on YouTube with English subtitles, where we will talk further on these issues and experiences, which will be a very nice platform to share and amplify the voices of these groups. So I just wanted to conclude that as these examples might seem remote to us, I would like to invite us to think how we can really bridge our lives, how can we bridge our experiences, privileges, and opportunities with these examples, at least taking the courage from the women we just mentioned. Thank you.
Thank you, Esin, and really thank you to all those women who are doing significant change on the ground, getting organized, connecting with each other for biodiversity, to prevent and respond to disasters, fires, and others. And yeah, we have a lot to learn from them, certainly. So this whole panel, I think, was really, really exciting in terms of really pointing to the directions for research methodologies, approaches, theories, perspectives, and practices that can help bring the wisdom at the grassroots level into policymaking and research. So going back to we started a little late, so we'll end a little bit late. We have about 20-25 minutes for discussion now. And if there's anyone here who would like to pose a question, you're most welcome to participate. But first, I would like to turn to the panelists. Going back to the original big questions we had, the first two questions had to do with what can we learn from the grassroots communities, and why is it significant to learn from the grassroots communities? I think the presentations responded to these questions beautifully, but what would you like to add more, or who would like to say more about these two questions? Catching my breath. Yeah. maybe you should use the microphone. Yeah.
Is this on? Yeah, no, I tried to kind of structure my presentation a little bit around that question, so I'm not sure how much I have to add, but maybe to say something about, because you talked a lot about what we can learn from the wisdom of marginalized communities, and perhaps I didn't focus too much on that in my presentation. I focused more on making inequalities visible. But I also think there was an element of that in my case study. Like, there was people that I interviewed that have so many like wonderful ideas for a better society. Well, one woman in particular, there was like a one woman protest movement in the local area, and she had this idea for a slow society rather than this fast society with the fast buses, and she had so many wonderful ideas, but no one that would listen to her. And I think there's definitely an element of that, listening to the wisdom in my case study as well. So, do you want to take over? Yeah.
I can also take up from there. So when we met with women foresters and Sarıkeçililer community, the women there, they have reflected what society reflects on them, which is that they are dismissed, their knowledge is not recognized. Even in cases of the nomadic groups, they are belittled, considered as, uncivilized. And that has left, we saw that has left real impact on these people, not being encouraged to take action or feel empowered enough or have to think that they have capacity enough to do what they need to do or what they can do very well. So having these community leaders like Pervin Savran here was really instrumental in finding the source of empowerment from within themselves. So not necessarily as the change, of course, which is important, but also someone was there to remind them of their own knowledge, of the importance and the depth of their knowledge. And we have used this magical word agency, and agency there comes really from there for them to discover their own resources, and that was really eye-opening to see for me.
Would you like to say more on these questions?
I'm not sure. I mean, I think what you both said is very important, and I think similar to what you said in situations, especially when we were doing these interviews about green gentrification, we found often the initial reaction might be, I'm not an expert, you should ask somebody who knows about that. So sometimes you really have to do an extra effort to convince someone of their own expertise and their own innate knowledge of a topic or their own lived experience. And at the end of the day, it's usually always worth putting that extra effort in.
So maybe I'll turn to Lara and Marina with the last two questions, and then I'll open it up to everyone to contribute to the discussion. What are some of the research methodologies? You've already talked about the use of art here, Lara. What are some of the creative research methodologies we can and should adopt so that grassroots voices are heard, and not only heard, but integrated into both research and policy? And what are some of the different ways of knowledge dissemination that can help, again, amplify those voices and integrate them into research and policy processes?
Yeah, just really to build on these amazing points about expertise, I think that's really crucial. And in a way, what the kind of arts-based approaches do is something similar about kind of recognizing that expertise and valorizing it. And in the case that I showed, offering those opportunities for leadership, even if they were very temporary and short-lived, to kind of feel that people could feel that they were more secure in their expertise. And then I think, a big question here is about transdisciplinary research. you know, how do we act as researchers when we go to be with the bottom-up initiative participants and leaders? And that's a big question about how we act in a way that's convivial and not extractive. No one wants to be case studied. And really for me, that's thinking with Donna Haraway, thinking about ideas around partial perspective. How do we come in, you know, be humble, join with others, acknowledge that we can't see everything from their perspective, but that we can join together and kind of see together in certain ways. And I think that's where kind of, you know, creating a mindful space is really interesting and important, where people, you know, the way in which people speak and how they speak, their claims to authority, those all happen with people's bodies, with people's non-verbal communication. And I think the arts-based research can really kind of maybe unsettle forms of expertise. Policymakers don't always feel comfortable being given some scissors and colored paper. So there's a way of sort of, you know, maybe suspending someone's authority in a gentle way, in a kind of convivial way, and then allowing people, you know, to lead a walk, to share their experience of space. So kind of how do we create those spaces where actually the non-verbal cues really matter, where, you know, we can kind of create a different atmosphere in a way that allows some people to be able to speak more, to surface the kind of, you know, even the sort of ontological commitments, like these questions in your case study, Lina, were amazing about what was a good and what was effective, and really kind of enabling people to speak to their experience without some of those preconceptions, perhaps from the top down, setting the tone already.
And I think your examples really highlight the ways in which we can integrate nature as a participant in this process, right? Using weeds or doing some of this in nature itself, which is, of course, everywhere. Thank you. That was very inspiring. Marina.
Yes, thank you. Maybe I'll mix a little bit the questions, as others have been doing, because the way what we learned in a way is also leading us to think how we should study. I think, for instance, what we learned, it was really observing how these initiatives, more or less spontaneous, more or less organized, but at very bottom-up level, they developed, and how incredibly creative this has been in terms of identifying solutions. So how many different things were created that we as researchers wouldn't have thought of, and how this is sort of creating a new social fabrics where some contradictions are taken care of. And I think this also dictates a bit how to observe this. And really trying and understand, because we talked of complexity, so this is part of the complexity. The problems are complex and the responses as well. So how do we find, yes, sometimes we have to say this is more or less successful from this perspective, for instance, in being inclusive, etc. But how do we decide that? So this is, of course, of course, you can be very, consult with people. I also wanted to mention how we did in acting with, and also in previous projects, in several projects with narratives, because the collection of narrative is really responding to complexity, because then you see how people, situations, it has always been difficult to study them, but how with this intersection of local and global dynamics, it is everything less foreseeable in advance. So before you had some clearer social categories of people, now you have people really who are mixing or reacting to a lot of factors, inputs, and I think really narrative is a very collective narratives and then analyzing, etc., is something that brings you really to the level of the lived experience of the person. And so you really see how in one person there's this complex interplay of forces, and what also the different ages. I was super surprised in the first circle when a colleague of mine, one interview to a homeless person, and how this person was concerned about the environment and his possibility to contribute to the struggle for the environment, constrained by several easily imagined factors, which you wouldn't have foreseen if you didn't really talk and have an open conversation with this person. So of course you need very open tools, open eyes, hearts, and then still you are a researcher, and then you still need to find ways. We tried with this qualitative comparative analysis to identify some big aggregations, which are never, ever always like that. You have to know, are probabilistic, but still can help you understand what, sorry.
No. Beautiful, thank you. And maybe from there, I can ask everyone, have there been surprises in your own research experience? Have you been surprised and challenged in terms of your own views as you were doing this research, the different kinds of research you've been involved in? Yeah, go ahead.
Again, not really about the marginalized communities themselves, but I was very surprised at the honesty of the policymakers I interviewed. And that's why I didn't mention the name of the city, because I feel like, I don't know why I feel like I need to protect them, but like the way they were speaking about the public and the way they were speaking about marginalized groups, it was so clear that they were so easy to ignore because they didn't speak up. And I find that quite surprising, I have to say, and disappointing.
Sort of similar to that, in the research that we did about green gentrification, we also interviewed real estate developers, and one, I was surprised how easily they agreed to participate, and two, similarly how honest they were and what sorts of really terrible things they would share about the way they really viewed the community that that lived in the places they were developing. Yeah.
Among the many ones, I wanted to say that when we were interviewing with our colleagues from forestry departments and also people from NGOs like Foresters Association on their projects involving, villages and to increase their resilience towards the forest fires, and we asked, how about the women? When you designed the project, have you considered special measures to reach the women? This was like a moment of pause and then reflection and then, realization that they have not. And then at the moment of the, interview, they have started to reflect and they have also acknowledged the importance of those questions. Even us asking the question has initiated thinking on their part, which is surprising in a way that it hasn't happened before, but also, nicely surprising that they were still open.
It also says something about the potentials of transformation through research itself. Yeah, Lara?
Yeah, I think I was surprised by the operation of art practice on two levels, one deadly serious in critique, for example, and the other being seen as quite frivolous. And it was really interesting, the power dynamics of that. At times, people were saying, but it's just art, like it can't actually do anything for sustainability. Yet on the other hand, it was like, right, well, information deficit models have failed and we need to do values and worldviews now, and that's art's job. So sometimes there were some really interesting politics within that. And sometimes people held views that were quite hybrid and could flip between those positions. That was a really interesting experience. Not always comfortable.
Maybe I'll say something about the research experience we had with working with goat herders, nomadic communities, especially the women there. And two moments. In one moment, we were in a tent having a conversation, an interview, and the woman was preparing some bread for us to serve us at the same time as talking to us about nature, her experiences, and so on. And then, she said to her husband, "Could you please close the door of the tent? There will be a storm soon." It had barely started raining at that time. And then, indeed, 5 minutes later, there was a major storm, and the winds were blowing into the tent. So if she had not closed the door of the tent, we would be all wet. And then I asked her, "How did you know?" And she was busy with the bread, with the fire, with us, meeting us for the first time. She said, I saw the movement on the trees. She knew from the way the leaves moved that there would be a storm and the direction of the wind and so on. And she's also someone who knows how that winter will be, watching the ants, the behavior of the ants. So she's barely literate in terms of how we understand literacy, but we are barely literate in terms of reading nature. I can speak for myself. And we're talking about doing research on nature and the ecological crisis, and there's so much to learn from the ways in which we can learn from nature and live with nature in harmony with nature that is already there in these grassroots communities, especially in the indigenous communities. And they knew, now the research that Esin showed, goats are being used all over the world in the Mediterranean region and elsewhere to prevent fires, because when goats graze in a particular area, the wildfires do not catch up. They can be prevented much more easily. These communities already knew. They didn't need to be taught. So if we had learned to listen to them, 10 years, 20 years ago, maybe we could have prevented or have been better prepared for some of the wildfires that we've been facing. And there can be many other examples that we can give, I think, in terms of what is already there in the indigenous grassroots wisdom, especially in terms of learning from nature, living with nature, in harmony with nature, as we face all these multiple crises that we have. So, yes, Tunçaya, please. Okay.
After listening to these inspiring speeches, I would like to add one more point. We are living in various crises: food crisis, energy crisis, wars, poverty, etc. This is because of the man-oriented culture, I suppose. So now we have to shift to a woman-oriented culture, which means creating new opportunities for the future of the planet and humanity. So, being in harmony with the past, maybe we should go back to Kibele, to Amazons, to learn more about the woman-oriented culture. All those examples show me that there are so many opportunities if we give space to a woman-oriented culture. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes. So we can take a couple of more comments and questions, and then we'll close.
Burçak İnel. I've worked on sustainable and inclusive growth, financing of growth for many years. One comment, one question. My comment is that the cases that you have talked about have enriched my understanding of how bottom-up interacts with higher level policies, national and supranational. Because until the panel, I was thinking more in binary terms, I guess. I was thinking of, let's say, a case that I'm very familiar with, Turkey and others, where the national policies, in the case of the former, are actually openly against climate, environment, etc. So it really is an uphill battle to be able to do something from the bottom up, as opposed to Europe, where we are privileged, very privileged, to have at least a national policy vision that is much more harmonious with nature and the boundaries of the planet. But I think the cases we heard provide a richer, more nuanced story. So the bottom-up always has to interact with the top-bottom, because the top-down, because there's always something to contribute. So thank you for that. My question is about the funding. I would be curious about how often you came across stories of things that people would have liked to do as a local initiative where there was just no funding. And how often does that figure out as a constraint, especially in the context of money becoming more and more scarce for the Green Deal? Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any comments or questions from the floor that we can take before we do the last round? No? Okay, so who would like to respond to the question of funding and to Sayar's comment?
Yeah, I can probably speak for anyone to say funding is very hard to come by and a major constraint for all of this action. And even where funding is available, and we're very grateful for it, we see this phenomenon of projectification where large institutions kind of want to do change-oriented policy and then chop that up into these little projects and disperse money in these very kind of small units, and that those kind of are really difficult for, in my experience, bottom-up practitioners to serve. They're like, kind of, they often describe themselves as hustling, kind of doing their work, lining up these little pieces of project funding, and every time reinventing their through line of interest, practice, or expertise to meet the goal of that particular small piece of project funding. And, you know, actually that just drains them of a lot of energy, and it's a very time-consuming and difficult process. And I think a lot of, you know, the work that we could be doing is to influence funders, actually. You know, if bottom-up initiatives are to contribute to sustainability, they also need a much more stable source of funding to be able to undertake their work. But maybe others would like to.
Maybe not directly reacting to the question, but following what you said, I think that's another way in which in Europe we're a bit privileged, because funding like Horizon Europe allows for approaches like co-creation and other types of participatory methods that in most or lots of other funding mechanisms is not supported or encouraged. And I'm thinking about that kind of as a researcher coming from the US and working for the last 9 years here. Even before all of what I mentioned about all of the research infrastructure there being kind of destroyed, it was much more strict, and the types of methods that we embed in projects like ACCTING here just wouldn't get funded there.
Thank you. No, I just because of your question, it made me realize that for the 10 pilot actions that we could fund in Resistere, and they are pilot actions implementing our directions for solutions, we had over 150 applications for those 10. I think it was 153. I'm looking at Art and Alain. Oh, 135. I'm mixed up the 5-3. 135.
Yes, so there's a lot of creative action on the ground that is looking for funding, and we need to certainly find new ways of funding and financing, and to continue the existing forms, and also perhaps to develop mechanisms where we can be resources for each other, you know, and multiply our understanding of resources. Again, learning from communities, grassroots communities that have managed with very little funding. But this is certainly a key point of, if we want to learn from the grassroots, with the grassroots, to create, to transform the world we're living in, we need that kind of participatory research, and for that we need funding. Would you like to add something? No. Yeah. I think we're now closing, yes. Yeah.
Okay, so sorry, this is something totally different. I showed on the slide all the research line leaders, partner organizations, and reminded by Esin, I just wanted to thank not only all my colleagues, but also wanted to mention, say out loud, the other partners, because we all participated in multiple research lines, but there have been partners who have been cornerstones, really, of several research lines, but they're not research line leaders. Okay, we have Sabanci University here from Turkey, then we have Yellow Window from Antwerp, Belgium, which, of course, was key in several parts of the project, but in research as well, and then Alexandru Ioan Cuza University from Iași in Romania, and we did this all together. I want them to be fully represented in the picture. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Marina. And yes, thank you all for your patience. This was a long morning, but I think a very, very inspiring, exciting panel. Thank you for the amazing work. And now I think it's time to eat and refresh ourselves and come back.
Almost,
Sorry.
Almost. Well,
back to the wonderful Colette.
Well, thanks to you for this wonderful first panel. You heard a few better stories here. If you'd like to hear about more, you may have heard that we have over 120 of these stories that are on our website. So if you want to find out, you can filter through different thematic areas. So please go and have a look at them on our ACCTING website, acting.eu. We have the 10 pilot projects Sophie was referring to. Some of them are described here in the posters, among other related initiatives, and you'll have the opportunity to find out more about them during the coffee break by walking around. And also at 13:15, we'll have a quick poster presentation session here. But before we go and have a lunch. Just another information is that if this panel has triggered thoughts or questions that you'd like to share, we invite you to write them down on one of the posters at the back during the session. So take a post-it, share your thoughts. If there's a key sentence you want a key takeaway, please share it. Or if it triggered other thoughts, please share it. Now, before we enjoy lunch, we'd like to invite you to come up all to the stage for a big group picture. So we're going to simply move the table back. Si vous pouvez remettre la première slide de la présentation. So all come up on stage. Stretch your legs. We'll have one line in front of the stage and one line on top of the stage. And sorry for stating the obvious, but if you have not provided your consent for the picture to disseminate, we encourage you not to stand on the picture. Okay, repeat again. If you have not provided your consent, if you do not consent for your picture to be disseminated, please take the picture instead of featuring on the picture. Thank you.